Hello friends, and welcome back to the Hall of Craft! Today, I'm making some clay huts and farmers crop fields for my D&D 5e campaign. So let's just jump right into it. So to start off this build, I'm just going to be using these packing trays that I have lying around. These will make a really good base for the clay huts that I have in mind. I'm just going to cut a few huts out of these more organically shaped versions. I want these huts to look pretty roughly made, so these will be a great starting point. The people in them are barely getting by, so I don't want to make these look too finely crafted. So I'm just going to use scissors and a knife to get these pieces apart. And once I do so, I'm going to pull off any of the excess pieces and to get these as flush to the ground as possible. Now for the crop fields. I'm just going to draw out some rectangles on a sheet of MDF chipboard. I'm choosing to make 4 fields, and each will be about 6 by 4 inches. And once I have those drawn on, I'm going to use a sharp Xacto knife to cut them out, making multiple passes and not pressing extremely hard, because I don't want to slip and cut myself. MDF can be frustrating to cut if you are trying to rush it. Now I'm going to quickly jump back to the huts. These packing trays make fantastic skeletons for the huts, but they have a few awkward gaps in them that I would like to fill. So I'm just going to cut out a few roughly sized pieces of cardboard and then hot glue them into place to fill in the areas that I was unhappy with. For the larger hut, I want to give it a large entranceway, much bigger than the other two. So I'm going to cut a strip of cardboard to the rough size, and then I'm going to use a pencil to give it like a bend so that I can more easily shape it into a curve. And then I'm going to cut it to fit onto the side of the hut. And I'll just use my hot glue gun to glue that on as well. Because I want to be able to put some tea lights inside of these huts when I put them on the table and have that light be visible from the doorways, I'm going to cut out the doorway and reinforce that connection with some more hot glue. Next, I'm going to add chimneys to these. So to do this, I'm just going to take some thin strips of cardstock and bend them around a pencil. I'll then hold them in place and use hot glue to give it shape. And then I'll use some more hot glue to attach it to the hut itself. I'm going to draw some rough grids on my crop fields for how I want the plants to be distributed. These turn out to be pretty irrelevant as I totally cover them up and you can't see them by the end. The only thing to take away from this is that there will be 3 lines of crops planted and that they're roughly an inch apart, so there's enough space for me to put miniatures in between the plants and use them on the table. Now it's time for the DM Scotty classic, the toilet paper and white glue paper mache. This is the same method that I use in my sun tree build. If you missed that video, link in the top right, you can check that one out. So the idea of this is that you can bulk up the shape of the huts to hide in the gaps with the watered down toilet paper, and once everything is in place, I soak it with a 50-50 water white glue mixture. I also put a lot of full strength glue onto the key areas once I'm satisfied with the shape. This method works really well for making a sturdy result with a lot of detail. The downside, however, is that it takes forever to dry. So I'm going to set this aside once I've finished sculpting it to my liking, and I'm going to put it in front of a fan overnight to solidify. Off camera, I also use the same method to create some little dirt mounds on my crop fields. And those are just on top of the lines that I had drawn out. For my crop fields, I want to create a wooden fence that goes around the perimeter of each of them. For the fence posts, I'm going to cut wooden dowels to roughly 1-inch sections with a pair of wire cutters. And for the planks of wood, I'm going to use coffee stir sticks, and I'm just going to roughly measure the distance that they'll need to space and then cut them to size. Once I have my planks and posts, I'll start securing them to my bases with hot glue. I'm going to take this moment to caution you, because when I added the white glue and water mixture to my MDF bases to secure the dirt mounds, it soaked in and kind of warped my MDF. And if you ask in message boards what the best way to not warp MDF is, people will tell you that you should paint both sides of the MDF to negate some of the warping. And that is what I'll eventually get to on these pieces. But for now, they're going to look a little curved. But for now, I'm adding the fences. This may have not been the best idea, as the warping actually got worse after doing this for me. I believe it's because the fences were holding the MDF in place and not letting it bend the way it wanted to. So something just to keep in mind if you're trying to replicate this build, maybe paint both sides of the MDF before you attach the fence, because if you do it like I did, the fence kind of holds it in place and doesn't let it curve itself back out. That's my thesis anyway, or my hypothesis anyway, as to why they're a little wonky. Once I have glued all my posts and planks together, I'm going to use my pliers to cut out an opening on each field. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm going to coat all of my pieces with the Black Magic base coat. This is just a mixture of Mod Podge and black paint. Link in the top right if you haven't experienced this before, but this is Jeremy's method from Black Magic Craft. This is going to really strengthen all my pieces and help hold them together. I'll wait for those to dry and then move on with the build. So after spending a few moments trying to bend my crop fields straight, I'm going to start working on the paint job. For the first step, I'm going to heavily water down some burnt umber and coat both my fields and fences with it. Once that's finished, I'm going to mix in some more light taupe into what's left on my palette of the burnt umber and use that to coat my huts. After those have all dried up, I'm going to take some regular brown and stipple it onto the dirt mounds of my crop fields. While that is drying, I'm going to move on and use a golden brown to coat all of the wooden fences. I want to differentiate the chimneys from the rest of the hut, but I don't want to make them metallic because the people who live here don't really have access to that kind of material. So I'm just going to use taupe straight from the bottle, and hopefully that'll create a bit of differentiation from the darker taupe on the huts. Time for dry brushing. To bring some darker tones and grittiness back to my crop fields, I'm going to dry brush them with a chocolate brown. After I'm finished with that, I'm going to dry brush some highlights with my light taupe, and I will use that same light taupe to bring out some of the details on my huts. The next dry brush will be using a suede. I'm just going to focus on the highest areas that would be catching the most light. After that, I'm not really loving the way the dirt mounds are turning out. I like the depth, but the color wasn't really working for me, so I decided that I wanted to add some green, specifically forest green and leaf green. I'm going to stipple those on and then just kind of wet blend them together. So I start with the forest green and then I kind of add leaf green to the middle of that while it's still wet. Once everything is dry, I'm going to cover it all in my homemade black wash. This is just a mixture of black and brown inks with some matte medium, flow improver, and water. This is going to darken everything up and make it look a lot more cohesive. Also, it settles into the recesses and really brings out a lot of the textures in the pieces. After that's completely dry, I'm going to come back and add a little more highlights. Starting with the suede, I'm going to give the huts and the wooden fences a really gentle dry brushing. Then I'm going to use a vanilla dry brush on the highest areas to add more highlights. I really like the vanilla because it's got like yellow undertones, so it gives everything a little bit more of like a sun-kissed look, so it's not quite so dark and gloomy. To make the chimneys look more like they have some soot on them, I'm just going to use some black paint and I'm going to rough up the area a little bit. It's not really a dry brush, it's not really like a full coat. I just kind of have some black paint on my brush and I just kind of mess it around and stick it inside the chimney and then hit the tips, and just kind of irregular painting method to make it look like a little more natural. So that's all the painting done. You could call it quits here and put these on the table and they would be totally serviceable, but I want to make it look a little better and I want to add some height to my crop fields. So I'm going to bring out my big box of foliage and I'm going to pick out a few things that I think will make good crops. Once I have my crops selected, I'm just going to start pulling them apart and using large beads of hot glue to secure them to the rows that I've established already. I'm going to use 4 different looking plants for variety. I'm imagining that these farmers have a field of things like corn and potatoes and they want to keep them all separate. For gameplay reasons, I definitely want to have some crops that are tall enough for player characters or enemies to hide in, and I think that that'll provide some interesting gameplay options. As a final touch for the huts, I'm going to take some hot glue and coat the rim of the chimneys, and then I'll put a small tuft of pillow stuffing and press it into place with a pencil to make some smoke effects. As for all my builds, I'm going to give it a quick coat of varnish when this is all together to protect the paint job, and I'm just going to use my airbrush to do that, but not bother filming it because it's not very interesting. But that's all there is to it. Overall, it's a pretty simple build, but the amount of detail that you want to add is totally up to you. In hindsight, I might have wanted to add some windows to my huts just to give them a little more dimension, but I was working on a timeline because I wanted to get these things on the table in time for my session, so I opted to keep it simple. But if you follow along, feel free to just go crazy with it. I'd love to see the photos. Subscribe if you want to see some more content like this. I have plenty of other crafting videos if you're looking to level up your painting or terrain making game. Let me know what you guys think down there in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like button if you had a good time. I'll see you guys in my next video. Have a great week. Alright, that might be it. Subscribe if you want to see some more content like this. I have plenty of other terrain. Fuck. Fuck. I hate it. The outro is always where I struggle the most.